welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, my friend? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. Another threat of nuclear war is upon us. Do you feel good living in Puerto Rico when these escalatory events happen?
Yeah, I mean, we're probably not a nuclear sponge, so I think I'm good. And I'm also not like a major city. And I guess, population-wise, we're not that big of a population. We are a strategic port, so I don't know.
I think
I think I feel better than New York City.
with Puerto Rico, what would happen? I don't think you would be touched, but you would get like a shitload of refugees and have all sorts of political problems, and obviously the entire world would suffer with food shortages. Mm-hmm. But you would probably be one of those spots of civilization, but the island would quickly become extremely crammed, and you'd have to deal with all that shit. So.
I don't think it would. I don't think it would get that crammed. I'm actually more worried about the supply chain issue, right? So I think Puerto Rico imports something like 80% of its food. We don't grow nearly enough food here to sustain life for very long. So I'd be more worried about starving before I'm worried about it becoming overpopulated due to refugees or something like that.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I guess it's not easy to get there. You are kind of far away. Like, where would refugees come from anyway, right? We're assuming that most of continental North America has been destroyed at this point.
Yep.
Or at least areas that would have been striked are not close to Puerto Rico. And if they were spared, they're probably like in the mountains somewhere, and like maybe like the Appalachian Mountains. But I mean, we did an entire episode on this. These places in the middle of nowhere, they're actually sponges.
Yep.
For nuclear strikes, because that's where we put our ICBMs. But before we get started on like the actual subject, maybe we should touch on this, because I know you had some stuff to say about this quote unquote ICBM attack, but allegedly it's not an ICBM attack. It was a different launching system. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, totally. I think, I just like you, woke up to that news and I'm like, ICBM, what the fuck? First of all, they don't need to use an ICBM. They're right next door to each other. But like if we used an ICBM against Mexico or Canada, like it's right next door. You really don't need an ICBM. That's like an extra flex, And then I started reading into it, and actually the missile system, it's a new missile system from Russia called the Oreshnik. And it is technically classified as an IRBM, or an intermediate range ballistic missile, not an ICBM, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile. Honestly, this is all like playing semantics. We had a whole episode on hypersonic missiles, which I'm pretty sure I got wrong too. And there are just these specific classifications, that you need to do, and in order to be considered an ICBM. And one of them is like, how far can it fly? Has to fly a certain, a number of miles to be able to be classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile. But the weird part about this one is the Oreshnik is technically classified as an IRBM when it's configured with a heavy warhead, so heavy payload, so like a nuclear warhead, for an example. But in the configuration that I think that they used it, and keep in mind, like, what the hell do I know? I'm sitting here in Puerto Rico, fog of war, all that shit. But from what I can see and what I've read, they used a lighter warhead, which would technically give it the range to be within ICBM range, to be classified as an ICBM. But what this missile was developed for is for intermediate range, not for like striking the United States or something like that. So what I find more interesting about like this situation is not like the semantical argument about, is it an ICBM, isn't it? Ukraine called it an ICBM, and then the State Department came out earlier and said that, oh no, it wasn't. It was an IRBM. And, if you do some Googling right now, you'll get mixed reviews on some websites are saying ICBM, some are saying IRBM. That's not really important. What's important to me is like what the impact, no pun intended, of this missile is, right? And I think the impacts are, there's a few angles for this, right? Well, one, you can go the Russian angle and you could say, hey, they fired this very specific missile to do two things. One, to be like, hey, we still got it. We still can use ICBMs, even though this is technically not an ICBM, but technically is. And two, it could be looked at on the Russian side as a way to like show some kind of like strength, like to show some pushback, to show that they're willing to, fight harder in the coming months leading up to the Trump presidency. Because we already see that on the Ukrainian side happening right now, with the increasing attacks and things like that. So they might be just ratcheting up the temperature. On the Ukrainian side, though, or at least on the side that's, siding with the Ukrainians, it is being used as kind of like a tool to, again, further ratchet up the tension, right? They're saying, oh, look, Russia just sent a ICBM. This is an escalation, right? Well, I mean, both sides have been shooting rockets at each other for quite some time, right? It's only very recently that Ukraine has been striking deep within Russian territory. But nevertheless, this isn't particularly escalatory, right? Like, I'd argue sending in North Korean troops is more escalatory. I'd argue that, I don't know, it's not really that much more escalatory than what's already been happening. So, in that case, you can think of this as kind of a little bit of saber rattling, a little bit of fear mongering to get more support either out of the United States before Biden gets out of office, or to get more European support again before Trump gets into office. So I'm more interested in how this development is being used as a leverage point, and less interested in, being afraid about Russia using ICBMs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm following you. Yeah, I don't think we're at actual threat of them, of the Russians striking us. It was a reaction from Biden authorizing them the Ukrainians to use long range missiles into Russian territory.
Yep.
However,
there's some evidence that they used the ATACMS
if
were given to them.
If you're Putin, I don't think that you really want to gear off the current track you're going in the war right now. Things are going in their favor right now. They're taking more territory than they have since the beginning of the war. I don't think they really want to derive from that. And I think the Ukrainians only have they had 50 and they used 6. If I read that correctly, I could be wrong. I'm not like a hardcore follower of what's going on in the ground. I'm just reading the New York Times and various other blogs. But yeah, I think you are right. Most of the rhetoric is political right now, and I don't think any of it really changes the direction of the war. Because what's going to happen is going to happen. I think the war is going to stay on course, and unfortunately, I think it will last past Trump's inauguration. But I don't know.
Think he's going to get rid of that on day one, like he said he would.
No, that's not going to happen, because politically they're not going to be able to. The Trump administration politically is not going to be able to agree with the Russians' baseline terms for negotiation. So I don't see the Trump administration coming up with a solution. If anything, I think they're just going to slowly whittle support until they put it all on the Europeans. But it will be over time, unless the Ukrainians completely collapse, which is possible, but I don't know how likely that is. But I guess time will tell. I feel like we had to talk about it just because we've talked about these missiles so much. Why not bring it up when there seems to be a new use of them? But why don't we get on to today's actual topic before we go way off course? So We are talking about the Boers. So the Boer War. And the reason why we're doing this is because, I was looking into the origins of the wars of the 20th century, specifically World War I and the Second World War. And the Boer War actually had a pretty significant impact on kind of the geopolitical landscape in Europe. The German support for the Boers maybe it wasn't that geopolitically significant, but diplomatically and politically it was extremely significant. The fact that Kaiser Wilhelm congratulating them on different successful military operations in that day of age, that those type of diplomatic gestures, they were far more, statesmen took them way more seriously back then. Now it's like, world leaders are constantly calling each other, horrible names and calling each other war criminals and all of that. And, it's all rhetoric. Back then it was different. People, these states took things much more seriously. So I wanted to like kind of start with the Boers, and what ended up happening is that I kind of went down we went down a rabbit hole of just going into like South African history. And which before doing the research and reading the books, which we'll share in our Substack on the topic, I really didn't know that much about. I knew kind of like the high level stuff, the Boers, the Dutch Boers, essentially rebelled against the British and all that. But I wanted to know, like, who were the Boers? Because they have an extremely wild history is the only way I could say it. Like, South African history is more comparative to the United States history than I ever realized. Like, the Boers are very much like, they remind you of like the early American settlers. But we have a third host on. Why don't we get the opinion of our third host, Reginald?
Finally, my moment. The Dutch, bless their soggy little tulip gardens, are a nation of cheese merchants and windmill whisperers who somehow stumbled their way into an empire. And the Boers. Imagine taking the worst bits of Dutch stubbornness, plonking them in the middle of nowhere, and adding a dollop of Calvinist self-righteousness. Presto, you've got a people who can argue with a rock and lose. Frankly, the Dutch were better off sticking to clogs and canals instead of mucking about in Africa and Asia, pretending they were conquerors. And as for the Boers, well, their greatest achievement was managing to make the British look magnanimous by comparison. Truly remarkable.
Okay. Well, you heard it here.
Well said, Reginald. Jesus. That was harsh.
Scathing review.
The way that I was going to take this episode is how cool the Boers were, but I guess they were kind of racist, all those things. But who wasn't back then? But
I would have thought that Reginald was so woke.
Yeah. Well, let's take this back. So the Boer, like, who are the Boers? So in order to tell this story or who they are, you need to go back into Dutch history. You need to go back into European history in the 17th century. So I'll start with like the dramatic story. So in March of 1647, the Dutch East India Company, they were returning home from the East Indies. And while rounding the Cape of Good Hope, they encountered this massive storm and it wrecked their ship. And they ended up in Table Bay, which is now present day Cape Town, South Africa. Now, everyone survives this shipwreck. And then, a couple of them were also rescued. But 62 of the crew members were asked to stay behind, and they had to salvage as much cargo as possible. So what they had to do is they had to live in Turtle Bay. They had to live in South Africa for a year until VOC ships, so Dutch East India Company, VOC, until they would arrive on their annual voyages. Because this is not a trip that was easy. Going around Europe and then going around the tip of South Africa, going to the other, voyaging to Asia. It was a harsh trip. So they had to wait a full year for them to get picked up. Now, this meant that they had to live off the land, and what they had in their ships wasn't really enough to survive for that year. So what these sailors did is that they had to build relationships with the local tribes. So the Khoi were the dominant tribe of that time. And the Khoi, so the tribes of South Africa in those times, when they encountered Europeans, they were often violent. Or maybe it was the other way around, but there would be clashes between Europeans and the native tribes in South Africa.
Sure.
So much so that the Portuguese were there first. They made those trips first. The Portuguese believed that these native tribes in the Cape, they made it just inhospitable for a permanent settlement. So they never really established their grounds there. And the Khoikhoi, it sounds funny.
Khoikhoi.
The Khoikhoi, they're an interesting tribe as well because they're, Africa is a diverse continent. People are genetically different everywhere, within every region. I think more so than any other continent. Africans have probably the most genetic diversity. And the Khoikhoi, the way that they're actually described by the Portuguese is that they're not even black, that they're like, more Asian look, like Asiatic looking, and that they're they just overall look different than other blacks that they've encountered. And these were if you look at the descendant tribes of the Khoikhoi now, you can find them on YouTube. They actually spoke. You know how in South Park there was the Starvin' Marvin episode?
Yeah.
Where everyone spoke and gluck, 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 gluck.
Yep.
This is how they actually spoke. This was their language. So they spoke.
There's still languages in South Africa like Xhosa, which is a clicking language.
Yeah. Well, they spoke in the clicking language.
I see.
They spoke the click, click, gluck, 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 gluck.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's pretty common actually right now. So yeah, makes sense. They still speak Xhosa right now. So
yeah, but that's mostly just in those tribes, not in the cities. They don't. The blacks who live in Cape Town or not don't speak that. But this tribe was a speaker of that. They weren't a Bantu speaking tribe. The Bantu speakers were further up north.
Got it.
So the Khoikhoi kind of developed this reputation among the Europeans as these non-primitive. They're not as primitive as the other Africans, because they were actually more. They were herders. That was their main thing. So they managed cattle. They weren't hunters and gatherers. So given the circumstances, the Dutch they're forced to cooperate with them and trade for food. And over the following year, these sailors come to the conclusion that this is actually a nice place. This is a good place to establish a settlement. As long as you can get along with the local tribes, what the tribes will do is that they'll barter their livestock for European goods. Mm-hmm. So they built these networks there, and South Africa has a good climate. There's areas that have fertile land. There's plenty of game to hunt as well. These guys when they were there, if you read the reports, man, they were shooting rhinos and stuff. So they were hunting big game. Just imagine that being some Dutch sailor. You're on your way back and you're in Africa and you encounter a rhinoceros.
A fucking rhino. Yeah.
Without any context. What?
Dude, Africa has the most megafauna on the planet. It's just most of those animals are fucking scary. But if you're brave enough and you want to shoot one, you're going to eat good. So.
Oh yeah. Or you can take a nice picture. It's funny that trophy hunting, people are, I would never have the inclination to go to Africa and shoot elephants are outlawed, but shoot a lion or something like that.
I wouldn't shoot any animal.
I would never want to do that. But those guys, they're huge money makers for those economies.
Yeah.
And they're big conservationists too. They drop money kind of preserving those lands because they want those animals to shoot, which is,
I think there was a lot of South African, not literally South Africa, but South of Africa nations that were having food shortages during COVID and post COVID, and they opened up game hunting of zebra and rhino and shit like that.
Oh, really?
Because they literally had to eat. They couldn't eat because of the supply chain issues and other issues as well, like drought and other shit like that too. But yeah, that was super recently, actually.
Imagine how terrible zebra tastes.
I can't imagine. It's probably really gamey.
It's probably gross. So I would want to try it though. So all right, going back to the story. So all right, these guys, they realize this is a good spot. and they go back to the Netherlands and they write a report to the company, and they basically make the argument that the Cape of Good Hope should become a permanent settlement, and this would be a perfect stopping point because a VOC ship, it took roughly 7 to 8 months for them to sail from Amsterdam to the East Indies, which was, their main colonial hub. Other resupply, they had other resupply stations throughout, off the coast of Africa, and they had one in Mozambique, they had one in St. Helena, but these station points, they would take them off course on the trip, and also they were also just like not in strategic areas before you were making like long voyages. Like imagine not stopping until you hit Mozambique,
right?
So they wanted a place where you can. The Cape was actually like the direct like middle point between the East Indies and the Netherlands. So they
you don't have to go very far off course either.
Yeah,
because if you want to go to Mozambique, you got to like hook back north to get there. And then you're going to have to come back down south. So it's like adding extra miles to the trip for no good reason.
Yeah. So the VOC is convinced of this report. They're like, okay, let's do this. Let's establish a settlement there. So in 1652, they established the settlement at the Cape. And this is the birth of modern South Africa. It's a byproduct of the enterprise of these Dutch merchants. And this colony, it had a very specific role. It was a link between the Netherlands and their Eastern Empire. The VOC, they had no other plans to create anything more than this small fortified base where annual fleets could resupply. It was never meant to become this large European settlement. It was never supposed to be Virginia or, something in the Caribbean. It wasn't. They didn't imagine this as like having these huge plantations and growing cotton and sugar and stuff like that. It was just strictly supposed to be a resupply point. And what happened is that when the Europeans came, is that they would have a very strict policy of having, they would say, okay, you need to treat these people good. We don't want to screw things up because we actually rely on the Khoi to raise the cattle that we're going to be trading for. But it came pretty self-evident that the local cattle, it wasn't enough to resupply these ships. The Dutch wanted more livestock, but the Khoi were only willing to give up so much of their herds. So by the second and third year of the colony, this barter system starts running into serious problems. And the Khoi, they begin to see the Dutch as more than just these temporary traders. They realized that they were going to be, here to stay, and they were going to be asking for more and more of their food supply. So the Cape itself, it didn't really have the population or the infrastructure to even like support a small amount of commercial activity. What the Dutch needed was they needed a self-sustaining colony that could produce enough food. So what they do is that they start granting the Dutch East India Company, they start granting its employees the option to settle permanently as free burghers. And that's a term you'll hear a lot in South African history, the burghers. And basically what these free burghers were is that they were men who had completed their contracts, and rather than return to Europe, they were offered plots of land to farm. And the idea was to turn them into these self-sufficient agricultural class that would sell food to the company at a fixed price. So these former VOC employees, they became the first settler farmers in the Cape.
Well, yeah, I mean, you were pointing out earlier that like at the time the Khoi started noticing that, these Dutch that are here aren't temporary traders and that they're probably going to stick around. So I can imagine that there was like a decent amount of like racial tension that probably came up in the early years of that Cape colony. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, when you think of South Africa today, even today, throughout most of its history. You think of like these racial problems that they had between whites and blacks, and even today, there's a lot of laws. It's extremely segregated, South Africa, where a lot of whites are kind of pushed into gated they kind of live in these gated cities now. There's a lot of like South African initiatives for black empowerment they encourage companies to primarily hire black people, and there's tensions. I don't know how much of it is overblown. There's these stories about these farmers who are having their lands confiscated and some of them being murdered and stuff. I've never really looked too deep into that political situation, but I mean, it's still in turmoil. And of course we know about apartheid, and in the 70s and 80s when South Africa was really a battleground for the Cold War, the racial problems were really bad. Those tensions were flamed by
literally the word apartheid was created because of the situation in South Africa. That's where the word comes from.
Yeah. And now they're, kind of the leader, and they're the leader with the prosecution. They're the ones who are leading the prosecution against Israel in the International Criminal Court. So it's interesting, but it's because of that their experience with apartheid, right. Is why they're doing it. But to go back even before Europeans settled in South Africa, it was described as essentially kind of a war zone. So in the book, one of the books that I've read for this is that it's called The Great Boer War by Byron Farewell. And I have a quote. It's an interesting quote. "There has been a conflict of cultures here, a race problem, for as long as men can remember, longer even, for archaeologists and anthropologists have exhumed the problem from the prehistoric past, a past so distant that it is uncertain whether the protagonists were actually human. In that dimly perceived period of history, hundreds of years ago, two types of humanoid creatures inhabited this land. Then, several thousand years later, there was but one, Homo sapiens. South Africa's first cultural conflict ended in the complete and utter extermination of one human species by another."
Oh shit! So we're talking about like biological evolution of the hominids here, like the Neanderthals versus the Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals were annihilated. Is that what he's referring to?
Yeah. So what he's saying is that South Africa was a battleground for different species, for humanoid species. This is where the extinction takes place.
As a side note, dude, I would love to do a like super ancient history, right? And like look into that, because I've been reading some stuff that suggests that it wasn't an extermination and that they just literally interbred.
It's probably a combination of both. It's hard to track. It's kind of
impossible to track. Actually, I think Byron Farwell is probably right. It's you can't really know. This is the hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Well, I mean, this book was written in the 70s, and it's in the context of like laying out the rest of the racial problems. So it is kind of like a dramatic part of the book. It's probably not you probably didn't really look that into it. And this book is not about
ancient hominid species.
Prehistoric South Africa. The book is about the political problems between the Boers and the British. But it's just kind of a flair. But I just thought it was an interesting quote to kind of lay out South Africa as this like ancient battleground of race, this ancient race battlefield to describe.
I mean, that's like a species battle at that point.
In the 70s when this book was written. You have to remember it was during the time of apartheid. Mm-hmm. So there's
Some
a
of
reason
that stuff might not hold up very well.
But what we do know though is that when the Dutch came, their relationship it did turn hostile with the native tribes, the Khoikhoi, And it started with like this tit for tat, low level conflict, but it eventually escalated into this full scale, quote unquote, racial war, where the Khoikhoi are, I'm not going to go into the details because it will take us too off track. But the Khoikhoi, there's a situation where basically the Khoikhoi are considered, enemies that should be shot on sight due to different like cattle raids and kind of low level conflicts. And the Dutch settlers go to war with the tribes, and basically what happens is that the Dutch settlers win this conflict, and the Khoikhoi become basically clients to the Dutch settlers. So they start working on the farms, but a couple of decades after the Khoi, most of this tribe, they actually either die of smallpox or they integrate, and they're just kind of fragmented and they integrate into other tribes. So this people that existed was essentially, annihilated. Like they no longer existed.
They were genocided
after the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
Because you also have to remember there's a lot of different tribes that are migrating at the same time in Africa. So a lot of them were absorbed into these other tribes. Now, after these victories, and this is primarily in like the 1670s, there was all this fertile land to settle. So over the following decades, the Dutch East India Company, they transported more European settlers to South Africa to cultivate this land.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this fertile land below the encircling mountain ranges that was basically just wide open. So over the following decades, the VOC, they transported these Europeans to settle this land in South Africa. And the settlers, where they came from, was a combination of Dutch, French, and German Protestants who migrated to South Africa. In France at this time, there was this mass exodus of French Protestants who were spreading out across all the other Protestant countries, mainly Germany and the Netherlands. Many of these French refugees, they found themselves in the Cape, where they assimilated into Dutch culture. The French were followed by, an additional wave of Dutch and then German settlers. What the VOC would do is that they would go to German cities, and then they would hand out pamphlets to like the poor, and they would encourage them to make their riches in South Africa. So they started pitching this to the downtrodden lower classes of Protestant Europe. So by 1700,
you're making before you get there, you're making the comparison to like U.S. A lot of the same shit kind of happened in Europe or the U.S. They're like, hey, down on your luck. Look, there's this place over here. They're accepting migrants. There's plenty of land out there. It's very fertile. You can do better out there than you can out here. And so a lot of these downtrodden German and French and Dutch settlers were basically, they were looking for the South African dream.
Yeah, but it was just a scarier place than the Americas. It's as scary as the Americas were, as well. It was no joke to go and fucking settle in, Virginia somewhere or North Carolina.
Sure.
Like people would get slaughtered by natives. They would not just slaughtered by natives, but they would die just of like not being able to survive and not having access to the advantages of living in like a modern city of that time.
For sure.
But it was
these were dangerous animals.
These were horrible environments to move to.
Yeah.
I wrote an article the other day about how Hitler would say that he would say that one of his motivations for Lebensraum was that the Germans did not feel like that he felt that the best racial stock of Germans had left for the Americas, because these were the people who were able to survive a cross-Atlantic trip and battle the elements into a new world, which left them with this kind of weaker cast of people, and that's why the living space was so important, because Germany could not support her population, or support their population. It's interesting, but these were tough people.
Interesting.
That's the point.
Hitler's
like
full of shit.
to be a settler,
yeah,
or to migrate to a new world, you had to be, you had to either be really down on your luck where you saw no opportunity at all, or you were adventurous and wanted to take on this challenge. Probably a combination of both. Now, so we have these settlers coming in. By 1700, I have the stat down. The population had to increase to 3,000 people, of whom 40% were settlers, and then half of these being children. Another 20% were company servants, while the remaining 40% were slaves. So the colony had expanded approximately 50 miles east of Cape Town.
And so they already had that slave population in place because they brought them with them, or because they acquired the slaves there. So
they didn't go to South Africa and enslave these tribes, because that would just cause all sorts of problems. What they did is that they would bring them from other trading posts. So initially, the Dutch East India Company, they did not plan on using slave labor in their Cape settlements. Like, slave labor was like for these big plantations in South Africa. They had a couple of them, but most of the farmland were, they weren't these big plantations. Transporting slaves too is a pain in the ass. It's like logistically challenging to deliver slaves from one post to another. Just think about how hard it is to keep all these people alive and feeding them, and the cost of it.
For that. Mm-hmm.
It's a high cost project to transport slaves. And South Africa was actually far from the major trading hubs, because the major trading hubs were in West Africa. Most American blacks, they can kind of trace their heritage to like a couple places in Africa where the slave trade was prevalent. It was West Africa, and Mozambique was another slave trading hub. But they're both areas regions that are, it's not a convenient trip to bring them to South Africa. But over time, they found it unavoidable to, in the morality of the time, they found it unavoidable. They weren't able to get enough settlers to sustain these farms, to settle these ships. So they moved into, they started bringing in slaves. And Cape slavery was unique. So it wasn't like slavery in the Americas. The slaves themselves, they came from a very, they came from a mix of linguistic and religious backgrounds. Most of the slaves weren't even from Africa, who were in South Africa. They were brought from Madagascar and Indonesia and India and Sri Lanka, and a lot of them were actually Muslim too. So you have this weird situation where, you have this like kind of complex social fabric that's developing there. Mm-hmm. And there's like this weird, import-export dynamic happening in South Africa. Local African groups didn't really face the full force of slavery on their own soil. Instead, the slave trade brought people from afar, creating this kind of, racial, social stratification. And, what I said earlier, like the slaves, the farmland there couldn't really support these large slave populations. So most of them would have a handful of slaves. They wouldn't have like an overseer. They would just be ran by the family and like their children. And kind of like this, a lot of them function as like servants. And there was this more like I don't want to say family oriented role, because that's like that. It's not the correct way to say it, but it was more of like this,
they were unpaid servants.
Yeah, that's a nice way to say it.
Yeah.
So
they're still slaves, better, to be very clear.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it was like a different dynamic than these like kind of factory plantations where there was just like a bunch of slaves, and you understand what I'm saying. So
yeah, totally.
in the early 1700s, most of the available land west of the first mountain ranges were occupied. So European settlers moved beyond the mountains to the north and the northeast into the dry interior, or along the coast below the southern mountain ranges. And I actually have all the maps on the Substack if you want to see like the migration patterns. It will make more sense if you can see an actual map of this, because it is complicated. So here's a chance to pitch the Substack. The Substack. Go to Bro History Substack. But at first, this was like only a seasonal migration to find grazing for their livestock. However, this became this permanent migration eastward into the South African Veld. And the South African Veld is just the raw wilderness. It's a very unforgiving and brutal place where you had to be a real, nut job or badass or whatever you want to call them to want to migrate through these areas. Well, you ever see videos of Kruger Park?
Yeah, dude, that's like where you see those like videos of the alligator fighting the lion, fighting like the rhino or some shit like that, and they're all getting to these like epic battles.
Yeah, shit. It's like,
it's crazy.
It's basically like animal UFC.
Yeah.
Kruger Park is this big wildlife reserve in South Africa, and you can just like all the videos they post online. It's like, lioness slaughters baby elephant, water buffalo versus crocodile, and there's just insane. It's some of the most insane animal footage that's probably on the internet, of just like the most
craziest fights, crazy situations, multiple like different belligerents. It's wild.
Yeah, it'll be like, crazy. I saw this video of these African dogs hunting this rabbit, and they just like tear it into pieces. And there's another video where they show this leopard who takes this little baby antelope and then pretends it's like her baby and then kills it. It's just some brutal nature stuff if you're interested in that sort of thing. But yeah, it was it
just sets the scene for like the place that these people decide to go live.
Yeah. Imagine living there. Like imagine living in a place where you could be killed by a lion in your sleep.
Right.
Lions will kill you. Like they're not, these are extremely dangerous animals. Yeah. It's extremely dangerous wildlife. And the tribes there did not like that, white settlers were moving there and taking and competing for livestock. Because what happens is that these settlers that move into the Veld, they're hunting for game, and they're following herds. They basically are nomads. So they have this nomadic lifestyle. To survive, one had to follow the herd. Farming in the Veld was not like farming in Europe. It's like this place that has these droughts, and then they have these big flash floods where you would lose everything. It was just a very, very inhospitable place to live. And what ends up happening is that these settlers, they start to resemble the Khoikhoi whom they displaced. So they start becoming their lifestyle becomes that of like one of the tribes, because they're always on the move. They're not staying in one place for very long. So the Afrikaners, and this is during the time of when this kind of identity emerges, this Afrikaner identity. They see themselves as this white indigenous tribe of the region.
Mm.
Like that's kind of like one of the sinners of Afrikaner identity, is that they see themselves as kind of like part of as natives to the land, because their ancestors, they lived in the wild, they battled the elements, they battled the tribes, they were at war all the time, and they've been they're and they're right in a sense, because their ancestors have been there for 200, 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they had these huge ass families, the population gets really big. They have like 10 kids each. So it's real interesting, like the cultural development with these people. They truly are this rugged bunch. Maybe it's a good time to ping Reginald and see what he thinks, or hear what he has to say about this.
Yeah, for sure. Reginald, like, what do you think about the Afrikaners? Do you think they're really an indigenous tribe? Like, what's there to that argument?
Oh, the Afrikaners as an indigenous tribe. Please spare me. That's like calling a house cat a lion because it sits on a rug. They may have wandered the veld in their ox wagons, but that doesn't make them native. It just makes them stubbornly misplaced Dutchmen with delusions of grandeur. Their whole white tribe's shtick is a quaint little fairy tale they told themselves while trampling over actual indigenous people. If anything, they're as indigenous as a spotted dick in the Sahara, utterly out of place and mildly offensive.
I actually kind of agree with you. We've had a lot of episodes on our show talking about like the origins of nations, and how there's always this kind of desire for a people to have this ancient ideology, this ancient history, to have a connection, a deep-rooted connection to the land. And this is seen across a lot of different societies and cultures. So I can totally see how this is, just kind of playing at an identity to solidify their claim to the land. What do you think, Reginald?
Ah, now you're talking sense. Every nation fancies itself the rightful heir to its little patch of dirt, weaving grand tales of ancient roots to mask a rather mundane reality. The Afrikaners are no different. They slap together a mythology of divine mission and frontier grit to justify their dubious claims. It's a tale as old as empire, really. Conquer, settle, and then pretend you've always been there. But here's the rub. They weren't exactly subtle about it. Calvinist sermons and ox wagon adventures do not an indigenous people make. It's less about a deep connection to the land and more about claiming the moral high ground while trampling anyone who got in their way. Classic colonial cosplay, if you ask me.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Reginald.
Wait, why don't you ask him, well, what about the British? They colonized all these countries. What makes the British so much better than the Boers?
Well, I mean, what about Reginald, what about the British? They colonized a shit ton of countries, way more than the Boers. Wouldn't the same argument be made against your people?
Yes, the British did plenty of conquering, true professionals at it, in fact. But here's the difference, my dear interlocutor. We didn't bother pretending we were indigenous. No need for fairy tales about divine missions or ancient roots. We simply marched in, planted a flag, and got on with the business of empire. Unapologetically. Say what you will about the British, but at least we owned up to the whole conqueror shtick. None of this pretense about being part of the soil. Oh no, we came, we saw, and we governed, however imperfectly. Unlike the Boers, who tried to gussy up their land grabs with biblical metaphors and self-pitying martyrdom. Truly tedious.
All right. Can't argue against that.
I don't know if I agree with him. I think that there's I think after a while you do build a connection to the land after centuries. It's the mentality is like, oh, we're just these imperial juggernauts where we just come in here and we govern, and you're lucky to get our civilization. Sounds a little
I guess you can kind of make that argument for the United States, right? So the United States, the people of the United States were originally British, and other peoples too, but primarily British, and then eventually they just said, no, we're not British anymore. We're American. We're different. So I don't know. Yeah, I could see both sides.
All right.
Interesting argument.
Thank you for your input, Reginald. Okay, so back to the Afrikaners. So I always think, whenever I think of an Afrikaner, I think of, you ever see the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
There's a song called I Am Africa, which is the funniest song in the entire, in my opinion, is the funniest song in the, it's like, we're not African because those are indigenous people, but we're Africa. Like, those are the lyrics of the song.
What does this have to do with the Afrikaners?
All right. So you can tell I'm tired. So over the 17th century, this distinct culture developed among the pioneers and the farmers who moved into the interior. And what these people are called, they're called the Trek Boers, the semi-migrant farmers. Their isolation from the Dutch East India Company, it fundamentally changes who they are. So they basically lose their connection with the Netherlands, and this identity was shaped by survival inside the African frontier, and most of all, the ongoing racial struggle against the natives, because they were constantly fighting with the different tribes there, and there were many. But there was still this affluent population in Cape Town who were called the Cape Dutch. However, the Boers, they're the population that sees like the big population booms because they're having many children. So the majority of the whites who live in South Africa, they're Boers. They're considered Boers. Now, something that's really important about Boer identity and what's Reginald touched on this is Calvinism. Yep. So the Boers, they interpret their existence on the frontier through the lens of Calvinism. So they saw themselves as not settlers, but they were on this divine mission as God's chosen people. So they
pilgrimage, if you will.
They were essentially like, they saw themselves like the Israelites who were chosen to inhabit the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
And that they were, this was, directly a mission from God. So, the Calvinist faith really, plays this big part in the development of their cultural identity. So the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, they try to keep the Boers within a boundary called the Great Fish River, the frontier, which was really just like the eastern edge of their controls. But the Boers, they really disregarded all the boundaries that were set by the VOC, because the VOC didn't really have any way to enforce them. It's this little company. So they had this kind of hands-off approach when it came to the Boers. But what really changes, like the next big thing that kind of impacts South African history here is the British. And we're coming up on an hour, so I don't know if we're going to get into everything, but we'll try to leave it at a good spot. So in 1795, the Dutch government was turned into a French client state, which led to the royal family's exile to Britain. While in England, the Prince of Orange asked them to take their colonies in order to protect them from falling into the hands of the French. And this was compelling to the British for obvious reasons. If the Cape of Good Hope were to fall in the hands of the French, then the British would use that, the Cape Town as a stopping point as well. Mm-hmm. And it was really important for them because they had their interest in India. So they used this as a pretext to secure their maritime interest. And the British invade in 1795, and after a few skirmishes with the Cape Dutch, the colony was in their possession, and the British hold this colony until 1802. Then they give it back to the Dutch, but then they retake it in 1806, and then by 1814 it became a permanent British colony. So I want to pull another quote from Byron Farewell. The Boers, like the British government, know better than they had the Dutch. They had, in fact, already developed an almost inbred detestation of any form of government. British concepts of justice and humanity conflicted with those of Britain's turbulent white South African subjects. From the beginning, her policies were designed to protect what she regarded as the interest of the natives and to prevent the abuse of slaves and Hottentot servants, who often lived in a state close to slavery. Hottentot, I learned, is an offensive word now, so we don't use that. To the Boers, it seemed that their British rulers were unduly interested in the welfare of these people. For the Boers, they believed in the right of every white man to beat his own N-word, and that the relationship between a master and his servants and slaves was a private domestic affair of no legitimate concern to the government.
Yikes.
The book actually said the real word. I just said N-word for obvious reasons.
No, that's good. I applaud you.
I don't want the podcast taken off the podcast waves.
Smart.
So, there's an immediate kind of, clash between the Boers and the British who arrived, who want to control things. And, this is the age of where there's an abolitionist movement, where the British were on their way of outlawing slavery. Mm-hmm. In 1813, the British set up a circuit court to let servants bring complaints against their masters. And the Boers called this the Black Court.
Jesus.
So in one instance, there was...
there.
What's that?
A lot of overt racism there.
Well, yeah, we're talking about South African history. Of course, there's going to be a lot of racism in this. So there was this one instance where there was a man named, he was a farmer. His name was Freek Biesenhout, or Biesendudenhout. Can you pronounce that?
Biesenhout.
Some freaky deaky Dutch name. He was a frontier farmer living in the Eastern Cape, and he didn't like the British. He rubbed the authorities the wrong way, and he had this reputation of being an overall difficult man. One day, one of his black servants accused him of withholding pay over false allegations of theft. So Freek, he was summoned to court, and he ignored his summons. In response, the British sent a group of 12 black policemen to detain him, and upon their arrival, Freek fired upon them. So they went to go arrest him for abusing his subjects, and he was killed in a firefight with the local police that included what they would call colored soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can imagine, this event led to all types of problems. Sending coloreds to arrest a white man over, and coloreds is like the term that they would use for people who were not, indigenous, but they could have been like the descendants of various slaves. This caused all sorts of problems for obvious reasons. So in the fall of 1815, Freek's brother organized a unsuccessful uprising against British colonial authority. So 60 out of 47 of them were captured and tried. And of them, 30 received exile sentences, and then 6 were sentenced to death. 5 of them were publicly hanged. And this is where it gets interesting, or this is where kind of like the martyrdom sets them. So when they came to be hanged, 4 of the 5 ropes attached to the gallows and snapped under the body weight of the prisoners. The men who were still alive, they started to beg for their life. And the crowd that was watching this public execution, they started begging for their life. They're like, please give them mercy. This is too much. These guys were like, just pleading for mercy not to be executed. What the British did is that they forced the prisoners to ascend back on the scaffold for a second time. and then the sentence was carried out, this time one by one with one single rope. So now they had to watch each one of their friends, their brethren, get hung, and then they'd have to go, which I imagine is a way worse way to be hung than to be hung with the group.
Yeah.
Because you're watching
didn't have enough fear in the first place.
Your necks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what I think that's probably considered torture.
Yeah. No, it's probably against some human right, today.
So these Boers that rebelled against the British, they are they're martyrs. And this becomes this like symbol of British oppression among the Boer community. Now, I want to ask Reginald, what does he think? Can you ask him if the rebellions deserve to be hung?
Sure. Let's figure it out. Hey, Reginald, we're talking about Slaughter's Neck Rebellion and those 5 guys who ended up getting hung. What do you think about that? Do you think they deserve to be hanged?
Oh, Slaughter's Neck, is it? A sordid little drama of frontier melodrama and misplaced martyrdom. Do I think they deserve to be hanged? Well, rebellion against the crown has its consequences, doesn't it? Especially when it's over something as trivial as being offended by the notion of basic justice for your servants. That said, the British didn't exactly cover themselves in glory with that spectacle, hanging 5 men and botching it so spectacularly that ropes snapped. Twice. It's almost as if incompetence was vying with righteousness for centre stage. Were they guilty? Certainly, but did the whole affair reek of performative justice and tone-deaf governance? Absolutely, a proper mess all around.
Yeah, I think I agree with Reginald here. I don't think that the Boers here should have been abusing their slaves or abusing their servants in that case. And I think they're intractable in the sense that they didn't want to kind of adjust their ways and just don't be a dick to other human beings. I think capital punishment for this is a little extreme, right? But this is different time, so they handled shit differently, different context. And then Reginald's absolutely right. It's just performative justice, right? So they're trying to make an example out of these 5 guys who undoubtedly probably did some fucked up shit, but it's all this like spectacle show shit. It's a little bit much. I think I agree with Reginald.
I mean, strategically, it wasn't a smart move. It was going to rile up the Boers,
right?
Not maybe if they just hung them, they would have like they showed off their authority and that they dominate the area. But the fact that it was done in this way, I mean, that's going to fuck with the population. Like they're going to hate you for doing that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So strategically, politically, it was not a good move. Now, I think we're gonna end after this last part because I think the next part will set up a good second follow-up episode. So the British had this big problem on the frontier when they come to South Africa. So over the years, the Boers were, as I alluded earlier, they're in this constant state of low-level conflict with different tribes. In the early 19th century, the Zulu emerged as this military power in the eastern part of South Africa. And they start expanding northward. And they start displacing tens of thousands of other Bantu groups who then migrated south into British-controlled territory. So as a means to establish political dominance, the British start creating buffer zones. And they start importing British citizens and also some Germans to South Africa to not only dilute kind of like the Dutch culture, but also just to not be so outnumbered by the different indigenous groups who are now migrating due to the Zulu conquest. But
so Zulus are super interesting. So maybe we could spend a little time on the next episode talking about them. But yeah,
we'll talk about the rise of the Zulu in the next episode. But where I'll end is what really is what really soils the relation, like the last straw, is that the British Parliament abolishes slavery in 1834. In South Africa at this point, the population had grown a lot, but the slave population had also grown a lot. So there was 40,000 slaves in South Africa at this point. And the colony relied heavily on slave labor, which left many farmers in in bad situations. So the Boers, they make the decision to leave. So what they do is they just get up and go. They leave the British-controlled colony, meaning that they start migrating en masse into the deeper frontier of South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called the Great Trek. And they start going out in these pioneer groups. And a lot of them they're going into Zulu territory, mind you. And they are just like battling the elements. Like it gets even crazier than it was in their first migration throughout the 18th century. So they take this extremely dangerous journey, and these different groups we'll settle at this because we can explain the Great Trek, because the Great Trek directly leads to the establishment of the first Boer states. And then we can also talk about the Zulu and their emergence, because they're an important player in this episode, in this story.
Sounds good.
Because the Zulu not only clash with the Boers, but the Zulu also fight the British.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can just leave it there.
All right. So what is... I'm just looking at my notes. Okay, let's end it here, and we'll save that. We'll do a follow-up, because I think there's going to be... Because the goal here is to get to the actual Boer War, but there's like a whole lot of shit that happens in between, and then eventually get to the international implications of how the Boer War impacts the global political situation.
All right.
But if you want to look at the maps, go to the Substack, where we're publishing articles to coincide with this podcast series.
I'll leave a link to it in the description as well.
We also have the episodes free of advertisements. If you join our Substack and become a member, we have a chat now. So for those who used the Slack previously, the chat in our Substack now does that. So you can join that. So join the Substack group, or the Substack page, Bro History. And then we also have a YouTube as well, where we put out clips of the show. Danny, is there anything else to add?
Nope.
All right. Peace, guys.
Peace.